When a space marine suffers wounds so severe that even the extraordinary regenerative capabilities of the Astartes' physiology cannot repair them, a choice is made by his brothers. Not by the warrior himself, who lies broken and barely conscious, but by the chapter's leadership. The fallen hero is deemed too valuable to simply die. His centuries of combat experience, his tactical knowledge, his very existence as a symbol of the chapter's legacy, all of this outweighs any consideration of mercy or peace. The Marine is dragged from the battlefield, his mangled form rushed to the chapter's most sacred workshops, where apothecaries and tech marines wait with tools of butchery disguised as salvation. What remains of the warrior's body is often horrifying to behold. Perhaps only a torso and head survive. The limbs torn away by plasma fire or crushed beneath the treads of enemy armour. Internal organs may be liquefied by blast trauma, bones shattered into fragments, flesh burned away to expose muscle and sinew. The apothecaries work with brutal efficiency, not to heal, but to preserve. What cannot be saved is removed without ceremony or anaesthetic. Limbs are amputated at the shoulders and hips. The gene seed organs are typically extracted before entombment, for they are too valuable to risk losing should the Dreadnought be destroyed in battle. What follows is a surgical nightmare that would break any normal human mind. The remaining biological mass, little more than vital organs clustered around a brain and spinal column, is prepared for integration into the Dreadnought's sarcophagus. The black carapace, that remarkable interface that once allowed the Marine to control his power armour as naturally as his own body, is fused directly into the Dreadnought's adamantium plating. Cables thick as a man's wrist burrow into the warrior's brain and spinal cord, creating neural pathways that will bind his consciousness to the machine. These are not gentle connections but invasive violations that pierce through bone and brain matter, establishing the mind-impulse unit linkage that will transform thought into machine action. The pain during this process transcends anything the Astartes' enhanced nervous system was designed to withstand. Hypnotherapy and psycho-conditioning can only dull the edge of an agony that seems to last forever, even though the procedure takes mere hours. Once the neural interfaces are established, what remains of the warrior is sealed within the sarcophagus, a coffin that measures perhaps 2 meters in length and 1 in width. The interior is filled with amniotic fluids, chemical baths designed to preserve organic tissue indefinitely. The warrior's head is locked into position, unable to move or turn, floating in this viscous soup. His eyes, if they remain, are often removed or simply left to atrophy in the darkness, for he will never see through them again. Every sense he once possessed as a human, or even as an enhanced Astartes, is severed. Touch, smell, taste, all are replaced by the cold precision of machine sensors. The sarcophagus is then lowered into the chest cavity of the Dreadnought chassis, sealed behind layers of armour plate, entombed alive in a metal womb from which there is no escape. The first awakening is described by those few Dreadnoughts lucid enough to speak of it as a descent into madness. The warrior's consciousness struggles to comprehend his new existence. He tries to move limbs that no longer exist, to breathe air that his lungs will never again draw, to feel sensations that have been replaced by data streams and sensor readings. The Dreadnought's optical systems flood his mind with visual information, but it is alien and wrong. Instead of seeing through eyes, he perceives through Auspex scanners and targeting arrays that display the world in overlapping layers of tactical data, heat signatures, and threat assessments. Sound comes not as vibrations in the ear but as acoustic sensor inputs that his brain must learn to interpret. The sense of touch is replaced by pressure readings on armor plating, his body now extending to encompass tons of adamantium and machinery. The psychological trauma of this transition cannot be overstated. The warrior awakens to find himself no longer human, no longer even truly Astartes, but something hybrid and monstrous. His thoughts, once his own, are now filtered through machine logic. His emotions, already tempered by Astartes' conditioning, become distant and alien. The sarcophagus becomes his entire world, a claustrophobic prison measuring less space than a coffin. There is no room to move, no ability to shift position or find comfort. The amniotic fluid is kept at precisely regulated temperatures, preventing even the minor relief of warmth or cold. Days blur into one another, for there is no day or night within the sarcophagus, only the endless darkness punctuated by the rare moments when he is awakened for battle or consultation. Many newly interred Dreadnoughts experience what can only be described as psychotic breaks during their initial months of entombment. They thrash against their restraints, screaming through vox speakers in voices rendered inhuman by synthetic vocal systems. They beg to be released, to be allowed to die, to be granted the mercy that was denied them on the battlefield. The chapter's chaplains and librarians work to stabilize these tortured minds, using psychic conditioning and relentless indoctrination to reinforce the idea that this existence is an honor, a continuation of duty, a gift rather than a curse. Some warriors accept this programming and find a measure of peace in their new role. Others never truly adapt, their sanity slowly eroding with each passing year until madness becomes their only companion in the darkness. The Imperium presents Dreadnought Entombment as the highest honor a Space Marine can receive, a chance to serve the Emperor beyond death itself. This narrative is carefully cultivated and zealously maintained. When a Dreadnought is awakened before battle, the ceremony is elaborate and reverential. Tech Marines chant litanies of awakening while applying sacred oils to the chassis. Battle Brothers gather to witness the ancient warrior's return, offering prayers and seeking his blessing. The Dreadnought himself, if he retains sufficient awareness, is expected to offer wisdom drawn from his centuries of experience to inspire the younger warriors with tales of glories past. This theatre of veneration serves a crucial purpose. It reinforces the lie that entombment is desirable, that to be sealed within a Dreadnought is to achieve a form of immortality worth aspiring to. But beneath this carefully constructed facade lies a darker truth. Many Dreadnoughts, when speaking candidly to those they trust, describe their existence in terms that reveal the horror of their situation. They speak of the crushing isolation, the endless hours spent in stasis where consciousness fades but never truly sleeps. They describe dreams that are not dreams but fragmented memories looping endlessly in the darkness of the sarcophagus. They talk about the growing difficulty in remembering who they were before entombment, as decades stretch into centuries, and the human aspects of their identity slip away like sand through grasping fingers. Some admit to welcoming battle not for the glory of victory but for the simple relief of sensation, of purpose, of anything to break the monotony of existence in the metal tomb. The problem of extended neural interface with a machine as massive and complex as a Dreadnought creates profound mental strain on the occupant. The human mind, even one enhanced and conditioned as thoroughly as an Astartes, was not designed to maintain constant awareness of machinery as an extension of self. The sensation of being a Dreadnought, of feeling one's consciousness spread throughout tons of metal and weapon systems, creates a form of cognitive dissonance that accumulates over time. Conditions such as lethargy, confusion, and dyschronometria, the inability to accurately perceive the passage of time, become increasingly common. The warrior's sense of self begins to blur at the edges, his identity merging with the machine until he can no longer clearly distinguish where his consciousness ends and the Dreadnought begins. Even more disturbing is the phenomenon of memory degradation. The Dreadnought's enhanced lifespan, potentially spanning millennia, comes at the cost of psychological coherence. Memories begin to fade or become confused. The warrior forgets faces, names, battles that once seemed unforgettable. He loses track of which century he occupies, unable to distinguish between events that happened decades ago and those that occurred mere months past. In some cases, the Dreadnought becomes trapped in endless loops of recollection, reliving the same memories over and over, unable to form new ones or move beyond the past. The person who is entombed gradually disappears, replaced by something that retains the warrior's skills and tactical knowledge, but has lost the human essence that once defined him. To mitigate these inevitable mental deteriorations, chapters adopt the practice of keeping their Dreadnoughts in stasis between deployments. The warrior is not simply powered down but placed into a form of suspended animation that slows his biological processes to near stasis. In theory, this preserves both the organic components within the sarcophagus and the sanity of the mind trapped inside. The Dreadnought sleeps away the decades, awakened only when the chapter faces threats severe enough to warrant deploying these precious relics of war. For the most venerable Dreadnoughts, those who have served for thousands of years, the ratio of sleep to wakefulness becomes extreme. They may spend centuries in darkness, roused once in a generation to offer counsel, or lead the chapter in its most desperate hours. But stasis is not true sleep. The consciousness does not rest in the way a living being rests. Instead, It exists in a liminal state between awareness and oblivion, a dreamlike void where time loses all meaning. Some dreadnoughts describe stasis as floating in an endless grey fog, aware but unable to think or move or perceive anything beyond the vague sense of their own existence. Others experience stasis as a nightmare state, where fragmented memories play out in distorted sequences, wars fought centuries ago replaying in the mind with the vividness of immediate experience. There is no peace in this artificial sleep, no respite from the burden of consciousness. The warrior simply ceases to actively suffer for a time, suspended in a limbo that is neither living nor dying but something cruelly in between. The awakening from extended stasis brings its own horrors. As the Dreadnought systems come back online and consciousness returns, there is often a period of disorientation and confusion. The warrior must remember who he is, where he is, why he has been awakened. Centuries may have passed since his last activation. Everyone he knew before his most recent sleep is likely dead. The chapter itself may have changed beyond recognition. New warriors bear unfamiliar heraldry. Tactical doctrines have evolved. The very enemies the chapter faces may be different from those the Dreadnought remembers fighting. He awakens as a relic from another age, a ghost thrust into a present he no longer recognizes or understands. Some Dreadnoughts emerge from stasis in states of violent confusion, their minds unable to immediately process the transition from the void of suspended animation to active awareness. They lash out instinctively, their massive weapon systems activating before full consciousness returns. There are recorded instances of Dreadnoughts killing their own tech marines during failed awakenings, crushing the very brothers who sought to rouse them in moments of disoriented panic. Other Dreadnoughts simply scream upon awakening, their vox speakers broadcasting sounds of pure anguish and rage as consciousness floods back into minds unprepared to receive it. These violent rebirths are hushed up, attributed to the understandable difficulties of transitioning from stasis, but they reveal the fundamental cruelty of the Dreadnought's existence. The physical deterioration of the body within the sarcophagus adds another layer of horror to the Dreadnought's fate. Despite the preservative qualities of the amniotic fluids and the constant ministrations of the tech marines, organic tissue cannot survive indefinitely without consequences. Over decades and centuries, the flesh begins to fail. Muscles atrophy completely, becoming withered strands of useless tissue. Skin takes on a grey corpse-like pallor. Organs that are no longer needed for survival in the sarcophagus begin to shut down or are deliberately removed to make maintenance easier. What began as the remnant of a space marine gradually becomes something that barely qualifies as alive at all. By the time a Dreadnought has served for a millennium or more, what remains inside the sarcophagus often consists of little more than a brain, portions of the spine, and the absolute minimum of vital organs needed to sustain neural activity. The body, in any meaningful sense, has ceased to exist. The warrior has become pure consciousness tethered to a few pounds of organic matter, suspended in chemical baths. Even this minimal biology continues to degrade. Brain tissue shows signs of deterioration, despite all efforts at preservation. Neural pathways become damaged and must be rerouted through augmetic replacements. The boundary between the biological and mechanical components blurs until the Dreadnought is as much machine as he is the remnant of what was once human. This physical degradation is reflected in the Dreadnought's psychology. As more and more of his biological substrate is replaced with mechanical components, the warrior's sense of humanity continues to erode. Emotions become muted, filtered through layers of machine logic. Memories that once held emotional resonance become mere data points, facts without feeling. The warrior begins to think more like a tactical cogitator than a sentient being, processing information and calculating probabilities without the messy interference of human emotion or intuition. Some view this as an advantage, a shedding of weakness that allows the Dreadnought to function as the perfect weapon. But others recognize it for what it truly is, the slow death of everything that made the warrior who he was, leaving behind only the shell of skill and experience wrapped in adamantium. The voices of Dreadnoughts, when they speak, betray the fundamental wrongness of their existence. The synthesized vocalizations that emerge from their external vox speakers bear only a loose resemblance to the original voice of the warrior within. The Dreadnought systems attempt to replicate the patterns of speech, the cadence and tone that the Marine once possessed, but the result is uncanny and artificial. The voice crackles with static, distorts with mechanical artifacts, carries an inhuman quality that makes conversation with a dreadnought an unsettling experience. This synthesized speech serves as a constant reminder that the being inside the machine is no longer fully alive in any conventional sense, that the person has been subsumed by the weapon. Yet despite all of this horror, despite the psychological trauma and physical degradation and crushing isolation, most dreadnoughts continue to serve. They answer the call to battle when awakened. They offer their counsel when their wisdom is sought. They embody the Space Marine creed that in death, duty does not end, that service to the Emperor transcends all considerations of personal suffering or desire. This dedication is sometimes attributed to the conditioning and indoctrination that all Astartes receive, the programming that makes duty and honour paramount above all else. But it may also reflect something darker, the simple fact that for many dreadnoughts, battle represents the only time they feel truly alive, the only moments when the crushing weight of their existence is temporarily lifted by the focus and purpose that combat provides. Battle offers the dreadnought a form of release from his prison. When weapon systems activate and targeting protocols engage, when his consciousness expands to encompass the full range of the chassis' capabilities, the warrior experiences something approaching the rush of combat he once knew as a living marine. The sensation of movement, even if it is the ponderous stride of a multi-ton war machine rather than the fluid motion of a human body. The feedback of weapons firing, the satisfying confirmation of enemy targets eliminated, the tactical satisfaction of a battle plan executed perfectly. For brief hours or days, the dreadnought is not a consciousness trapped in a metal tomb, but a warrior doing what warriors do, fighting the enemies of the Imperium with skill honed over centuries. This desperate need for the stimulation that only battle provides creates a cruel irony at the heart of the dreadnought's existence. The very thing that justifies their suffering, their continued service as weapons of war, becomes the addiction that makes their imprisonment bearable. They fight not just because it is their duty, but because the alternative, remaining in the darkness of stasis, or the isolation of the armory between battles, is unbearable. Combat becomes a drug, the only thing that makes existence seem worthwhile. And when the battle ends and they are returned to sleep, the crash into darkness is all the more terrible for having tasted, however briefly, something that felt like life. The chapter's leadership understands this dynamic and exploits it ruthlessly. Dreadnoughts are deployed strategically, their awakenings carefully timed and manage to maximize their effectiveness, while minimizing the strain on their deteriorating psyches. A dreadnought kept in constant deployment will burn out quickly, his mind fragmenting under the sustained stress of active consciousness. But one who sleeps for decades between brief periods of wakefulness can serve for millennia, his usefulness extended almost indefinitely through careful management. The warrior trapped inside has no say in this calculus. He awakens when his brothers decide he is needed. He sleeps when they determine his continued service requires rest. His existence is managed like that of any other weapon in the chapter's arsenal, maintained and deployed according to tactical necessity rather than any consideration of his desires or needs. The degradation of a dreadnought reaches its most horrifying expression when the warrior falls to chaos. What was already a prison of metal and flesh becomes something infinitely worse, a fusion of demonic corruption and technological nightmare that transforms entombment from mere torture into absolute damnation. The Chaos Dreadnought, particularly in its most corrupted form known as a Hellbrute, represents the complete annihilation of whatever remained of the warrior's humanity, leaving behind only rage, madness, and suffering without end or purpose. When a Space Marine turns to chaos and is subsequently interred within a dreadnought, the transformation differs fundamentally from that experienced by their loyalist counterparts. The traitor legions lack the reverence and careful maintenance that Imperial chapters lavish upon their entombed veterans. For the forces of chaos, a dreadnought is not an honoured relic but a weapon to be exploited, a disposal method for warriors too damaged to fight effectively, but too valuable to simply discard. The entombment process itself is often conducted not as a ceremony of honour but as punishment, a way to eliminate rivals or silence dissenting voices within the warband. A critically wounded Chaos Space Marine may find himself sealed within a dreadnought sarcophagus, not because his brothers wish to preserve his wisdom and experience, but because his lord desires his continued service while removing any threat his independent will might pose. The sarcophagi used by the traitor legions are themselves corrupted by millennia of exposure to warp energies. Unlike the carefully maintained life support systems of Imperial dreadnoughts, these pseudo-parasitic containers are twisted parodies of the original technology. The amniotic fluids are tainted with warp essence, burning through the flesh they are meant to preserve. The neural interfaces do not simply connect the warrior's mind to the machine, but burrow like living things into his consciousness, establishing connections that cause excruciating pain with every thought. The entombment process, already traumatic in Imperial practice, becomes an ordeal of pure agony that drives most newly interred Chaos Space Marines into immediate insanity. The Hellbrute represents the ultimate expression of this corruption. Over time, the boundaries between the warrior's flesh and the dreadnought's metal begin to dissolve. The organic components within the sarcophagus literally fuse with the chassis, muscle and sinew melding with steel and adamantium until the entire machine appears to be constructed of demonic flesh rather than metal. This fusion is not metaphorical, but physical and visible. The Hellbrute's armor plates pulse with what seems to be organic tissue. Cables and power conduits writhe like tendons. The sarcophagus itself becomes indistinguishable from the ribcage of some monstrous creature. The warrior's remains absorbed into the very structure of the war machine. The process of becoming a Hellbrute is agonizing beyond any description that human language can adequately convey. The warrior feels his flesh responding to the warp energies saturating the chassis, feels his body betraying him as it reaches out to merge with the cold metal that imprisons it. Tentacles of unknown origin, perhaps demonic manifestations or perhaps extensions of the corrupted machine itself, burrow into his nervous system and establish connections that send waves of pain cascading through what remains of his body. Unlike the controlled surgical precision of Imperial entombment, this fusion is chaotic and organic, a cancer that spreads through both flesh and metal until neither can exist independently. The warrior trapped within experiences this transformation while fully conscious, unable to escape or die, forced to feel every moment as his body becomes one with his prison. The psychological effect of this fusion completes the destruction of the warrior's sanity. The Hellbrute pilot does not simply interface with the machine as Imperial dreadnoughts do. He becomes the machine in a literal sense, his consciousness expanding to fill the entire chassis, while simultaneously fragmenting under the strain. The sensation of being simultaneously everywhere and nowhere within the Hellbrute structure drives even the most mentally resilient Chaos Space Marines into complete psychosis within days or hours of the fusion beginning. The rare few who retain some shred of sanity during this process invariably beg for death, for destruction, for anything that might end their torment. But death does not come easily to a Hellbrute, and the suffering continues for decades or centuries. An eternity of madness sealed within a body that is simultaneously alive and not alive, flesh and not flesh. The madness of the Hellbrute manifests as uncontrollable rage and violence. When awakened from whatever passes for sleep in their corrupted state, Hellbrutes emerge as frenzied berserkers that attack everything within reach. They cannot distinguish friend from foe in their fury, seeing only targets to be destroyed, enemies to be torn apart in the vain hope that violence might somehow end their suffering. This makes them extraordinarily dangerous to their own allies. Chaos warbands that deploy Hellbrutes must keep them chained and restrained between battles, their weapons physically removed to prevent them from turning their fury upon their own forces. Only when battle is joined are the Hellbrutes unleashed, their chains released, their weapons reattached, transforming them into living hurricanes of destruction that will obliterate anything in their path until they are finally destroyed or their targets are annihilated. The Thousand Sons employ a particularly cruel variant of Hellbrute creation that exemplifies the callous disregard Chaos Forces show for their entombed warriors. Sorcerers of the Rubric Legion offer warriors from other warbands promises of power and knowledge, tutelage in the ways of sorcery and access to forbidden secrets. What these deceived Marines receive instead is entrapment in a Hellbrute chassis. The sorcerers conduct elaborate rituals that bind the victim's consciousness to the machine while simultaneously using warp fire to flay the flesh from his body. The warrior remains fully aware throughout this process. Feeling his skin blacken and peel away, his muscles char and contract, his organs cook within his body cavity. What eventually gets sealed into the sarcophagus is a burnt mass of organs, bones, and nerve fibers that somehow still lives, still thinks, still suffers. The resulting Hellbrutes are among the most unstable and violent, their madness compounded by the memory of their betrayal and the endless agony of their burned flesh. Between battles, when not actively deployed, these Thousand Sons Hellbrutes hang in special halls within Chaos vessels and fortresses. The amniotic sacs containing their charred remains are suspended from chains, surrounded by demonic entities that press against wards placed to keep them from devouring the helpless warriors within. The Hellbrutes remain conscious during these periods, unable to sleep or find any respite. Tormented by demons, they can sense but not fight, driven deeper into madness with each passing moment. The sorcerers maintain that this treatment enhances the Hellbrutes' destructive capabilities, that the accumulated hatred and suffering makes them more effective weapons. Perhaps this is true, but it represents a level of cruelty that transforms the already horrific existence of a Dreadnought into something that defies any concept of mercy or honour. Yet even among the traitor legions, some Chaos Dreadnoughts retain a measure of sanity and cognitive function. The ancient Contemptor pattern Dreadnoughts, relics from the days of the Great Crusade, possess superior systems that place less strain on their pilots. Warriors entombed in these rare chassis do not inevitably descend into the madness that claims those sealed in lesser patterns. They maintain their tactical acumen, their memories, even aspects of their personality across millennia of service. These Contemptors are highly prized by Chaos Lords and Warpsmiths, for they represent the pinnacle of Dreadnought technology without the catastrophic mental degradation that renders other patterns barely controllable. Ironically, entombment in a Chaos Contemptor is considered preferable to many fates within the traitor legions, one of the few circumstances where being sealed in a Dreadnought is genuinely desirable rather than a curse or punishment. The Imperium's newest Dreadnought pattern, the Redemptor, introduces a different kind of horror to the already grim existence of entombed warriors. Designed specifically for the Primaris Space Marines created by Archmagus Belisarius Cal, the Redemptor represents the cutting edge of Dreadnought technology, incorporating systems and capabilities that far exceed those of the ancient Castroferum pattern. It is larger, faster, more heavily armed, and more responsive than any Dreadnought pattern in common use. The neural links are more sophisticated, allowing the pilot to control the massive chassis with surprising dexterity despite being entombed within its sarcophagus. On the battlefield, the Redemptor is a devastating presence, able to annihilate infantry formations with its onslaught Gatling cannon or melt enemy armor with its macroplasma incinerator, while simultaneously crushing anything that comes within reach of its oversized power fist. But this superior performance comes at a terrible cost that makes the Redemptor perhaps the cruelest variant of Dreadnought ever created. The advanced systems that give the Redemptor its capabilities also place enormous strain on the pilot, a burden that far exceeds what other Dreadnought patterns demand. The hyperdense reactors that power the chassis and the sophisticated neural links that allow for precise control require massive amounts of energy to function. Much of this energy is drawn not from the Redemptor's mechanical systems, but from the pilot himself, leeching his life force to fuel the machine's operation. The Tech Marines who designed the Redemptor paid little attention to the health and longevity of the warrior sealed within, viewing him as simply another component to be burned through and replaced as necessary. The result is a Dreadnought that literally consumes its pilot. After sustained periods of operation, perhaps a few months or years of active deployment, the warrior within the Redemptor sarcophagus begins to deteriorate at an accelerated rate. His organs fail faster than they can be repaired or replaced. His brain tissue degrades under the strain of the neural interface. His life force itself seems to drain away, pulled into the machine to power systems that care nothing for the survival of the consciousness operating them. Many Redemptors that have seen extended combat have already required their sarcophagi to be replaced. The original pilots burned out completely, reduced to husks that could no longer sustain even the minimal life functions required for consciousness. In the worst cases, pilots have been found reduced to nothing more than sacks of blackened organs, their bodies so thoroughly consumed by the Redemptor systems that nothing recognizably human remained. These desiccated remains are given final burial with whatever honors the chapter deems appropriate, but the fact remains that the warrior was not killed in glorious combat, but slowly drained of life by the very machine that was meant to preserve him. The Redemptor does not offer the extended service of traditional Dreadnoughts, which can function for millennia with proper maintenance and care. Instead, it burns through pilots in decades or less, making it fundamentally contrary to the entire purpose of Dreadnought technology. This accelerated burnout raises disturbing questions about the Imperium's priorities and the Mechanicus' ethics. The Redemptor was created during the Indomitus Crusade when Primaris Marines were plentiful, and the demand for powerful weapons was urgent. In such circumstances, the decision to deploy dreadnoughts that consumed their pilots rapidly might have seemed acceptable, a necessary sacrifice in a time of existential threat. But the continued use of the Redemptor pattern after the immediate crisis suggests a darker calculation. The Primaris Marines entombed in these machines are effectively being used as living batteries, their lives measured not in millennia of honoured service, but in years of rapid consumption. They are disposable in a way that traditional dreadnought pilots never were, valued more for the short-term tactical advantage they provide than for any long-term contribution to the chapter's history and wisdom. Some chapters have attempted to modify the Redemptor to reduce the strain on the pilot, but these efforts have largely failed. The fundamental design of the chassis makes it impossible to maintain its superior performance without drawing heavily on the pilot's life force. Reducing the energy drain would require decreasing the Redemptor's capabilities, effectively turning it into a less effective weapon. The Mechanicus has shown little interest in addressing this flaw, viewing the rapid burnout as an acceptable trade-off for battlefield effectiveness. The warriors sealed within Redemptors are aware of their fate, knowing that their service will be measured in years rather than centuries, that they will not become venerated ancients passing down wisdom to future generations, but will instead be consumed and forgotten, replaced by the next critically wounded Marine deemed suitable for entombment. This knowledge adds a layer of desperate urgency to the Redemptor pilot's existence. Unlike traditional dreadnoughts who can look forward to centuries of intermittent service, punctuated by long periods of stasis, the Redemptor pilot knows his time is severely limited. Every battle might be his last, not because of enemy action, but because his own chassis is killing him. This creates a paradox where the Redemptor becomes simultaneously more willing to take risks in combat, knowing he has little to lose, and more desperate to avoid deployment, seeking to preserve what little life remains to him. The psychological impact of this accelerated mortality is profound, stripping away even the cold comfort that traditional dreadnought pilots find in the promise of centuries of continued service. The individual stories of named dreadnoughts across the Imperium illuminate the various ways this existence manifests in lived experience. Bjorn the Fell-Handed of the Space Wolves stands as the oldest surviving dreadnought in the Imperium, having served for over 10,000 years since the time of the Horus Heresy. Bjorn fought alongside Leman Russ himself, witnessed the birth of the Imperium, and survived through its subsequent millennia of decline. His consciousness spans an incomprehensible length of time, and the strain of this extended existence is evident in his patterns of deployment. Bjorn now awakens only once per millennium, roused at the dawn of each new 1,000-year cycle to hold court at the Space Wolves' great feast. The rest of the time he sleeps in stasis, his mind unable to sustain active consciousness for extended periods without fragmenting entirely. When Bjorn does awaken, he serves as a living link to the chapter's earliest history, offering counsel based on experiences that predate the current form of the Imperium. But the price he has paid for this longevity is immeasurable. 10,000 years of existence in the darkness of a sarcophagus, waking only to give advice or fight in the chapter's most desperate hours before being sealed back into sleep. The warrior who once walked beside a Primarch who fought in the Emperor's name when the Imperium was young and vital, now exists as a fragment of consciousness preserved through technology and determination. Whatever Bjorn was as a living man has been eroded away by millennia, leaving behind only the core essence of duty and memory, a ghost in a machine that refuses to die, because dying would mean the final loss of irreplaceable history. Ancient Rillanor of the Emperor's Children represents a different kind of horror, the dreadnought who remains loyal even as his entire chapter falls to corruption around him. Entombed during the Great Crusade, Rillanor awakened during the Horus Heresy to find his brothers twisted by Slanesh, their noble aspirations replaced by hedonistic excess and perverse pleasure-seeking. For 10,000 years Rillanor remained hidden, his dreadnought chassis concealed in the ruins of a dead world, maintaining his loyalty and sanity despite the absolute isolation. When finally discovered by traitor members of his former chapter, Rillanor chose destruction over corruption, detonating a virus bomb in a final act of defiance. His story illustrates the nightmare of being a dreadnought who outlives not just individuals but entire eras, watching everything he fought for become perverted and destroyed while trapped in a body that will not die. Murderfang of the Space Wolves embodies the complete mental breakdown that can afflict even the most stalwart dreadnought pilot. Once a respected warrior, the Marine who became Murderfang descended into complete feral madness, his consciousness consumed by uncontrollable rage. The Space Wolves maintain Murderfang in their fortress, but awaken him only when they require pure, unthinking violence. Once released, Murderfang attacks everything in sight with berserk fury, making no distinction between friend and foe. After the battle, if he survives, the Tech Marines must immediately force him back into stasis before he turns his rage on his own chapter. Murderfang represents the endpoint of mental degradation, the warrior whose mind has shattered so completely that nothing remains but instinct and violence, a cautionary example of what awaits all dreadnoughts if they serve long enough. The Bloodraven's Davian Thule demonstrates the progressive mental instability that characterizes many dreadnought pilots. Formerly captain of the 4th Company, Thule was grievously wounded and entombed in a dreadnought chassis. Initially, he retained his tactical acumen and personality, serving effectively as both warrior and advisor. But over time, his behavior became increasingly erratic and unstable. His memories began to fragment, his personality to shift between states. What should have been a triumphant continuation of his service instead became a slow decline into confusion and rage, his identity eroding under the strain of existence within the sarcophagus. Thule's fate illustrates that mental degradation is not an exceptional outcome but an inevitable one, the question being not whether it will occur but simply how long the pilot can resist it. Malkarian of the Night Lords, a Chaos dreadnought, spoke with unusual honesty about his existence, describing it as torture and unending suffering. He characterized each awakening as a descent back into pain, each return to battle as simply trading one form of anguish for another. For Malkarian, there was no glory in continued service, no satisfaction in victory. His existence had been reduced to a cycle of sleep that offered no rest and wakefulness that brought only more suffering. When he spoke of battle, it was without enthusiasm or pride, viewing combat merely as a temporary distraction from the crushing reality of his imprisonment. Malkarian's perspective strips away all pretense and propaganda, revealing the dreadnought existence as the nightmare it truly is. The dreadnought represents one of the Imperium's most profound philosophical contradictions. It embodies the principle that duty transcends all other considerations, that service to the Emperor supersedes any individual desire for peace or death. This aligns perfectly with the Imperium's ideology, which treats human life as expendable resource to be exploited in service of larger goals. But the dreadnought takes this principle to its logical extreme, creating a form of existence that is objectively worse than death yet is presented as a high honor. The warrior is denied even the mercy of dying for the Emperor, instead forced to continue existing in a state of perpetual suffering for centuries or millennia beyond any reasonable lifespan. This forced immortality serves the practical needs of Space Marine chapters. Dreadnoughts preserve tactical knowledge and combat experience that would otherwise be lost when veteran warriors fall in battle. They serve as living repositories of the chapter's history, able to recount events that occurred centuries ago with the accuracy of an eyewitness. They provide psychological continuity, their presence linking current warriors to the chapter's founding and reinforcing traditions that might otherwise fade over time. From an institutional perspective, dreadnoughts are invaluable assets that justify the suffering required to create and maintain them. The individual warrior's pain becomes irrelevant when measured against the collective benefit to the chapter. But this utilitarian calculus reveals the fundamental inhumanity at the heart of the Imperium. The dreadnought pilot is not asked whether he wishes to continue serving. He is not given the choice between honorable death and continued existence in torment. That decision is made for him by his superiors, who judge that his value as a weapon exceeds any consideration of his preferences or well-being. He becomes property, a tool to be used until it finally breaks beyond any possibility of repair. The propaganda surrounding dreadnought entombment serves to obscure this reality, transforming what is essentially enslavement into something that can be celebrated and aspired to rather than feared and resisted. The physical form of the dreadnought itself serves as a grotesque metaphor for the Imperium's treatment of its subjects. The warrior is literally sealed within layers of armor, unable to escape, unable to move freely, able to interact with the world only through weapons and sensors. He has been transformed from a person into a weapon system, his humanity subsumed beneath functionality. The external appearance of the Dreadnought, impressive and intimidating, conceals the horror of what lies within, just as the Imperium's grand rhetoric about duty and honor conceals the systematic exploitation and dehumanization of its citizens. To look upon a Dreadnought is to see the Imperium in microcosm, power and majesty, built upon a foundation of suffering and sacrifice. The finality of the Dreadnought's fate adds another dimension to its horror. Unlike other forms of injury or misfortune, entombment is permanent and irrevocable. Once sealed within the sarcophagus, the warrior can never leave. There is no possibility of recovery, no hope of healing, no chance of returning to any semblance of normal existence. The decision to inter a critically wounded Marine in a Dreadnought is a decision to end his life as a person, while forcing his consciousness to continue existing as a component of a war machine. This permanence transforms the Dreadnought from a medical intervention into a form of eternal punishment, a sentence to life imprisonment within a body that is simultaneously coffin and weapon. Some Dreadnought pilots come to accept their fate, finding meaning in continued service or peace in the knowledge that they contribute to their chapter's glory. These warriors embody the Astartes' ideals of duty and self-sacrifice, transforming their suffering into purpose through sheer force of will and conditioning. But acceptance does not erase the fundamental cruelty of their situation. A prisoner who comes to love his cell remains a prisoner. A slave who takes pride in his work remains a slave. The Dreadnought who finds satisfaction in battle remains a consciousness trapped in a metal tomb, denied death and agency, existing solely to serve purposes determined by others. The alternative, refusing entombment or actively seeking destruction, is largely unavailable to most Dreadnought pilots. By the time a Marine is critically wounded enough to warrant consideration for Dreadnought status, he lacks the capacity to resist. He is unconscious or barely aware, unable to voice objections or fight against the apothecaries and tech Marines who work to preserve him. The decision has already been made before he regains sufficient consciousness to protest, and once entombed, escape is impossible. The Dreadnought cannot simply will his own death or shut down his life support. He continues existing until external forces finally destroy the chassis containing his biological remains, a destruction that might not come for centuries or even millennia. In the end, the Dreadnought represents the ultimate expression of the Imperium's grinding, relentless machinery of war. It is a system that takes its greatest heroes and transforms them into weapons, that denies them even the dignity of death in exchange for centuries of continued service. It is technology in service of an ideology that values function over humanity, duty over mercy, tradition over compassion. The Dreadnought stands as a monument to suffering, a walking reminder that in the grim darkness of the far future, even the honoured dead are not permitted to rest. They march on, sealed in metal tombs, their minds fragmenting over centuries, their bodies reduced to minimal organic components suspended in chemical baths, existing in a state that can be called life only through the most generous interpretation of the term. They are the ultimate martyrs to a cause that demands everything and offers nothing in return except the cold comfort of continued service. And when they are finally destroyed, when the last vestiges of their consciousness finally dissipate as their sarcophagus ruptures and their biological components fail, it comes not as tragedy, but as the mercy that was denied them for so long, the final piece of an ending that should have come centuries or millennia ago.